Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Night Shift with Andrea Up Late. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good. We are rapidly approaching the holiday season, and I don't think I'm ready. Hey to everybody in the chat so far. For all of you who might be new here, this is a true crime podcast, so keep that in mind when listening. And we are a live YouTube show as well. So there are people in the chats that we sometimes engage with. This can come in handy with some of the more complicated cases when people have questions, and it's nice to bounce things back and forth off of each other. You guys in the chats, let me know if you're having any difficulty hearing me. I kind of moved the mic around a little bit. But either way, I hope you guys are doing a set of co-hosts, if you will, here. But I've got a good old trusty handy co-host that may be coming back here in a moment.
Yeah, I'm here. My camera's off.
Okay. Well, does anybody recognize this voice? So tonight with me, I have BC Sanders, co-host of the Disruptors podcast with BC and Ski. They have their own YouTube channel as well, and he's kind of working on a camera situation for those of you that are watching in YouTube world. But in terms of podcast, we can kind of start to talk. How are you doing tonight, BC?
I'm absolutely wonderful until about 30 seconds ago, so I apologize. Completely unprofessional of me. My camera went down. I think it's back up.
Yeah,
so I hope
absolutely.
We're good.
Absolutely.
And that's my fault.
Hey, Teresa. Hey, David J, Davey, Janae. We got in the chat. Here we go. All right, there you are.
Sorry.
Happy Tuesday. How you doing?
Yeah. Oh, I'm good now.
All right.
Yes, I'm ready. I'm ready to dive in and get to talking.
All right, we'll get to talking, and at the end of the show, we will tell people who you are for any listeners that may not be familiar with you. All right. Hey guys. So I first learned about this case not long ago, and it was actually from a Dateline episode that Keith Morrison covered. I think back in like September. The case happened in 2005, and I don't know how I didn't know about this because it's incredibly interesting. Is everything muted and good and all that good stuff?
Gosh.
I'm
so sorry.
That's good. So it's a really interesting case, and it's kind of gotten some traction recently. Like I said, Keith Morrison covered it on like a 6-part Dateline podcast episode called Murder in Apartment 12. I encourage you all to listen to it. It's going to take some time to get through. The episodes are like 30 to 50 minutes long. And like I said, there are 6 of them, but super interesting. I've been listening to that for a while. And then I just started reading about this case. As you know, if you are a listener of Night Shift with Andrea Up Late, I do cover a lot of unsolveds, or I'll let you give me your idea on this one, BC, and our listeners, because this one, while it is deemed unsolved, I would not say that it's cold. And I think that we may all have a decent idea as to what happens. But I don't know. We'll see. There's some tricky twists and turns on this one. So you ready to get started, BC?
Yes. Let's go.
All right. For those of you who aren't familiar, BC Sanders is a retired homicide lieutenant, so he can provide a lot of insight and expertise when we talk about a lot of these cases. How crime scenes are developed, and how once things go to trial, what that means in terms of evidence, in terms of the prosecutors, in terms of the homicide team that investigated the case, all those kinds of things. So he can answer all of our questions in that sense. And so that's always helpful on a show like this. So tonight, everyone, we will be talking about the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer. Nona Dirksmeyer. Nona was born on December 26th of 1985. In a really small town called Zachary in Louisiana. It's in a particular, I think, like East Parish. Forgive me, I'm not that familiar with those parts of Louisiana. Her parents were Paul and Carol Dirksmeyer. Now, Carol met Paul when he was actually an instructor of hers when she was in college, and he was a good bit older than she was at the time. So they get married. They wind up having 5 children, one of which is Nona. So Nona graduates from Dover High School in 2004. In the winter of 2005, she was a student of Arkansas Tech University. She was a sophomore that year. She majored in music education and she was involved in a couple of different choirs. She sang in her church choir, and she was very involved in her local community. She was a member of Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and she was known to be very kind, but very, very shy. So we're going to talk about what she kind of did to come out of her shell a little bit as time went on. So when Nona was 10 years old, her father passed away. Excuse me, guys. I've been battling a little bit of a sore throat. So if my voice gives out, my kids will be happy. Her mom went on to raise Nona and her siblings in a small town there in Arkansas. They eventually were kind of in a suburb of and then right into Russellville, Arkansas. So Nona had a small group of good friends, like I touched on a moment ago. Kevin Jones was a boy that she had known since forever. So pretty much her whole life, since they were in kindergarten, she and Kevin had become very good friends. Their families were, particularly Kevin's, were very involved in their relationship as well. They eventually started dating. And so his family specifically will talk about how that Kevin and Nona were inseparable. She was always at their family gatherings and cookouts and birthday parties, etc. And they were just very, very close. But Nina was a shy girl. So she had blonde hair and green eyes. I will put, if you're watching on YouTube, there was in the thumbnail a picture of Nona, and I will put all of this on the Andrea Up-Late Instagram page probably tomorrow to show you a picture of her. But she was a beautiful 19-year-old girl. She had short blonde hair, green eyes. She played the flute. Her academics excelled. She was said to have a gorgeous soprano singing voice. In fact, it's very difficult to find any clips of her singing whatsoever, but in every account that I read, everyone is always noting this. So evidently she enjoyed singing and was quite talented at it. So during her sophomore year of high school, Nona's best friend Chelsea noticed something. So she noticed that Nona had been cutting herself. We've talked about this kind of thing before. When particularly a teenage girl, that tends to be the higher population of those that practice cutting. It's generally not a cry for help in the sense of wanting to end one's life. It's actually just kind of for them almost more of a therapeutic and stress reliever. It's used in that kind of way. Do you have anything to touch on there, BC?
Yeah, when you say mostly female, predominantly female, I would agree with that. But I did have a person, I won't say where or what assignment of work or wherever I was, but that was the first time I met someone who habitually cut, and he had multiple. I mean, his entire arm was horizontal scarring.
Okay.
But that's what he had explained, is that he felt almost like compulsive.
Okay.
Had to do it. So sometimes there's signs, sometimes there's not.
Okay, exactly. So we know that Chelsea, excuse me, Nona's best friend, did notice this in her. Now, Kevin knew this about her as well, but he kept a little bit more quiet. He was really kind of her rock. If she would have a little bit of panic attacks or some anxiety, Kevin was always there for her. Like I said, they'd known each other since they were, 5 years old. But when Chelsea noticed this, she was alarmed, and Chelsea told her own mother about this. So now Chelsea's mother goes with Nona to be supportive of Nona as Nona explains to her own mother, Carol, what she's been doing. So it was at this time that Nona reveals a very, very terrible secret. And she tells her mother, Carol, that her father, who passed away when she was 10, had actually been sexually abusing her much of her childhood until right around the time that he died. Carol's words in interviews later about this were, quote, "It was horrible. It's such the end of my world. I just couldn't believe something like that would happen, but I knew enough to know that she was telling the truth." We'll speak more on her mom as this show goes on for sure, but that's what she had to say when she, in recalling when Nona told her about this. So that explains a little bit when we talk about her cutting and her anxiety attacks and these kinds of things. So just after she graduated high school, she and Kevin both went to Arkansas Tech. So they were both attending there as freshmen. After their first year of college, Kevin transferred to the University of Arkansas, and that was about 90 minutes away. Excuse me. In April of 2004, Nona's mother married a man named Dwayne Diapert. Okay. Originally, Nona was living at home with Dwayne and her mother. They moved into Dwayne's house pretty soon after Mom and Dwayne got together. So they first lived there, but then we realized that Dwayne had some pretty strict rules. For instance, he will, to this day, call himself a neat freak. He actually just says that he's very tidy. He did not like animals in the home, so they were forced to get rid of their 2 Dachshunds they had, and the mom did. So they get rid of their pets. So just keep some of these things in mind. We know now that Nona had quite a tough childhood in ways that that her family didn't know about, as far as we know. And then years are going on. She's graduating high school, going to college, and now Mom's seeing this man, and she's getting rid of her family pets. They got rid of the cats they had. And then we realized that Dwayne's first question to Carol, Nona's mother, before they went on their first date, was, "Do you cook and clean?" Now, look, I am far from excuse me, from a feminist. I'm far from any of those things. I actually enjoy cooking and cleaning. But I don't think this man said it in a way that was kind of a joke or anecdotal. I think he was very serious about it, and it was actually his expectation. But as some say, every pot has a lid, right? So Carol was fine with it, and that's fine, to each their own. However, Dwayne was strict all the way around and had some other rules. So he actually said that nothing good happens past 10 p.m., which I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong when you're a teenager. However, because of this, he demanded that everyone, adults and children, which Nona was a young adult at this point, but be home by 9 p.m. so doors could be locked by 10 p.m. And that was a hard and fast rule, and there was no getting around that. You guys remember, she's in college. She's 19 years old, and he demands that she's going to be home by 9 p.m. Mother, Carol, is going along with this. Like, we've now given up the dogs. We've moved in with this guy, and now he has these rules for her daughter that he really had just met a year prior. And as you can imagine, Nona was not okay with this, and she decides to go on and get an apartment at the Inglewood apartment complex. They're just off campus. Now, there are some disputing reports on this, but I've read some that Dwayne, kind of foot the bill for this or helped out with it. But either way, she moved out. She didn't want to be in any way associated with Dwayne, with his rules at least. So by now, she and Kevin had been in a relationship for about 5 years. Kevin would say now, and he is later noted on her obituary as such, that they were engaged and that they were poor college kids, so she didn't have a ring. And after their first year of college, that's when Kevin transferred out to the University of Arkansas. Is about 90 minutes away, and they started learning what a long distance relationship would look like for them. And they exchanged numerous phone calls and text messages. And you got to think, when you're 19, an hour and a half away after you've been side by side like that, particularly these two since kindergarten, that's a long way. That's a long time. You're going to feel like you're not going to hardly see each other again to be an hour and a half away. Now, at this time, Nona had started, at the urging of her friends, she had begun to compete in kind of small local beauty pageants. So she was kind of doing the pageantry circle. Like I said earlier, she was very involved in the local community and like the Big Brothers and Big Sisters organization. She really enjoyed mentoring these children. And I believe that, you coming back to me? I believe that, that she, at this time, is when she first tried out or competed, for Miss Arkansas. So that was kind of her goal, was to become Miss Arkansas. And I'm sure she would have had bigger goals in the pageantry circle afterward, but she wanted to use that platform as a way to speak to children who had been sexually abused growing up. So I think it's pretty neat that she kind of like endured that. And as time went on, especially when they talk about her being shy, I've heard this with a lot of people. I've known people who are a bit shy and a bit introverted, but once they get on stage or once they, certain things will turn them on. And I think that for Nona, when she got on stage on the pageant circle, that's when she kind of lit up and was not shy, was not introverted. And I think that that's why that was such a great place for her. And I just think really, I don't know, it speaks to her character that she wanted to use her experience to then speak to children about that. What do you know? You're pretty shy until you get on podcasts, right?
Yeah, I don't ever talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I thought about you. So I'm glad that when you get on, you actually engage.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So this is when Kevin starts visiting Nona on the weekends. He's pretty much a regular at her apartment at this point every weekend. The rest of the time, they kind of, like I said, would chat and text and all these kinds of things. She would send Kevin messages if he didn't answer sometimes. I think we're all familiar with these types of texts that say, like, are you alive? I'm saying that because this comes into play a little bit later on in this show. We'll cover it, but I don't find anything weird about her saying that. And I think that's just kind of basic text talk, particularly we're talking teenagers, y'all. So now it's the holiday season of 2005. Okay. Kevin is home from college and he goes to Nona's apartment. He spends a night there on the 14th. So then on the 15th, like late in the evening, he drives back to his parents' house in Dover. He gets there, it's like just after midnight on the 15th. He calls Nona. He says he calls her around he had made a couple other phone calls and finally calls her around 1:30 in the morning to let her know that he had made it there safely and that he was going to bed. So Kevin wakes up the next day and had a message from Nona that said, "Good morning, Cuddle Muffin. I love you and I hope you have a great day." Oh, 19-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
So Nona had an exam that morning. So her plans were to have an exam for her sophomore year, right? That morning leading up to the Christmas break. Then right after that first morning exam, she had an appointment to go be with her, the little sister that she was mentoring through the Little Sister program. And then she had like a midday afternoon exam later that same day. So Kevin had gone back home to see his parents because he knew that Nona had this day ahead of her. And he actually had agreed to escort his mother. She was a librarian at the local school there, and he was going to escort her to like a little holiday party they had that evening. So he was kind of spending the day at his parents' house instead of with Nona. Excuse me. So Kevin was expecting to hear from Nona after she took her exam. He didn't hear from her. He kind of started calling and messaging her up until that afternoon around 6 p.m. At this point, that's when he was about to get in the car with his mom to take her to the Christmas party. So his mom will recall later that Kevin was saying to her, that he was getting concerned that he couldn't reach Nona. It wasn't like her not to answer her phone. And her words, she put in quotes that he said, "Mom, I can't go to this party and wonder if she's okay." So he wasn't really digging going to this Christmas party until he knew for sure that she was good. So then Kevin decides to call his friend Ryan, who delivered pizzas there locally in Russellville. So he asked Ryan if he was going to be around that area, like where Nona's apartment was. And Ryan said that he was. So he said, "Can you just go check on her for me and let me know?" So Ryan goes to Nona's apartment and he gets there and he calls Kevin to say, "Yeah, like her car's here. The lights are on in the apartment. So I don't know what to tell you, but it looks like she's home." So Kevin asks Ryan to go knock on the door. He's like, "Would you just knock and just check on her to see what she has to say?" But she didn't answer. So then he tells Kevin that, "Hey man, I don't know what's up. The lights are on. Nobody's coming to the door. She's not answering. I don't hear anything in there." And this actually alarms Kevin quite a bit. So when he learns of this, he and his mom get in the car together and get to Nona's apartment. So Ryan's already there, kind of waiting outside by the front door, which is locked. And Kevin and his mother pull up. So they knock and knock and knock some more. They ring the doorbell. No one answers. Kevin does have a key to the apartment, but he did not have it with him this evening. So they race to the back of the apartment where there's sliding glass doors. And he at first tells Ryan he didn't think he'd be able to open it because Nona would always keep, like I don't know, I'm sure it's got a real name, but like the burglary stick thing in the sliding glass door so you can't open it. And she was known to be very safety conscious. I feel like we say this a lot with these cases. Like I don't know if someone would ever say that about me. I'm safe. My stuff's locked. All right. But I don't know if anybody, but you know what I mean? Like she's known to be particularly safety conscious, but I hear this about a lot of these girls, and she was living alone and she's 19. And so for instance, one of her girlfriends would say like, hey, I'd have to call her on the phone before she'd even come to the door to open it for me. So she was very aware of her surroundings in that way. And that's important to know moving forward in this case. But they do get back to the sliding glass doors, and Kevin starts to grab the handle there, and it opens. It actually comes undone for him. And so we hear later when everyone is talked to and kind of interviewed that Kevin kind of looks around and flings the door open. And before he can move, his friend Ryan is saying, dude, don't you see her there? And Kevin had not seen, but what the situation was is that Nona was actually lying right there in the living room on the floor in front of them. So she was motionless. She was naked, except for she was wearing little white socks. Kevin runs on inside. There was blood on her face. She was lying on her belly at this point. There was blood on her face, pooled all around her. Her eyes were closed, and there was blood underneath her body. So Kevin turns her over and attempts CPR. Now, it gets a little disputed on exactly the order of events with the call to 911. But I think ultimately what I've gathered is that Ryan, his friend, calls 911 first and then is letting Kevin's mom in because she's still standing out front, just kind of, she doesn't know at all the scene that's unfolding because they've had to go around back to that sliding window or door to get in, right? So kind of this is all happening at once. Kevin is on top of Nona, her naked, bloody body, providing CPR. Ryan's on the phone 911. He lets Kevin's mom in, and it sounds like he handed the phone at some point to Kevin's mother because we do have 911 calls with her on the phone there. So first responders get there, and as you can imagine, here everything gets started, right? Before too long, Nona's mom gets there. Her words, Carol, she has said later, quote, "It was just a big shock. Devastating. It was awful. I told them I wanted to see my baby. It was awful. Of course, they said you can't. They had the crime scene tape up." So they say later that at first Carol had actually assumed that or thought that Nona had committed suicide. This was so random and unexpected, of course. And she had some anxiety issues and stuff in the past. So that was her initial thought until she realized how gruesome the scene was and that was not at all the case. As investigators started to go around, they realized that there's no forced entry. There was an empty condom wrapper. Okay. It was lying on the counter just a few feet from Nona's body. It was actually on like a kitchen. Some things say a counter, some say on a kitchen table. Either way, definitely not in an area where you would necessarily expect it. But they say that there was no physical evidence that she had been raped. We'll talk a little bit more about the medical examiner and autopsy as time goes on. Her head had been smashed, and lying next to her body was a lamp. So this lamp is one that's kind of got a circular round base that's like, if you can picture like metal that tapers like narrowly out to almost like a disc-shaped base that's heavy. And it looks a little bit, the lamp is a little tall itself, maybe between about 1.5 feet tall, maybe. So like a long skinny one with that base at the bottom that's heavy. The base of the lamp did have blood and hair on it. There was blood stains on the light bulb of that lamp, which later are going to be called prints. but we'll talk about whether it's a smear or a true print. And they think that whoever had hit her, like with the fatal blow with that lamp, excuse me, had actually first used their fist to her face so hard that it caused bruising on her brain. She had then been stabbed, and this left cuts around her neck and shoulders. They describe them as pretty shallow. In fact, sometimes they say stab wounds, sometimes they say cuts. It looks more like somebody just kind of has a knife and is fighting, just a lot of struggle fighting, not what I think a lot of us would consider true stab wounds. But to the point that the medical examiner has said later, or the investigators, that potentially it looked like maybe she had been raising her shoulder to protect her face and neck. And so that's why like shoulder keeps getting hit. And then she was strangled, like manual strangulation. There were finger pad bruises around her neck, and her hyoid bone was broken. And then it sounds like the fatal blow was actually the lamp base to the back of the head. Now, when that happened, it actually broke the skull and pushed the back of the skull into Nona's brain, which would render her, at the very least, very brain damaged. But ultimately, this is the blow that killed her. All right. So the condom wrapper, we're going to talk about that a lot. It was open. There was no condom found ever throughout the investigation at the crime scene as they developed it. Okay. And I'm going to use the word developed in a very loose way here. So side note really quickly, if you did see an Instagram story that I put up about it, and I said that we would be talking about the idea of tunnel vision in a homicide investigation. And simply what that means is that when someone comes on scene and immediately an opinion starts to form, and once that seed is planted, that opinion grows stronger and stronger until it is no longer an opinion. They're treating it as fact. And then I think in a roundabout way, start getting confirmation bias. We talk about that, right? Where you make the case fit this narrative that you've come to in your head. Now, I don't talk ill of investigators. I don't, but I'm honest about the things that I read and the things that I see. And that's where it's going to be handy to have BC here with us, with his background as well, to kind of delineate this and kind of dissect this case and go through this with me, because I will say this case is one that not even arguably, I'm not the only one. In fact, I think almost everyone has seemed to come to this conclusion since this happened, but this was a shoddy investigation. This crime scene was not properly developed. I want to hear BC's thoughts on it, and if he actually will disagree with me on this, because he may, but it's very interesting. But I always know that there's things that I don't think about because that's not my background. I'm a nurse. I'm not an investigator, but we're going to talk about how this goes. Yeah. And back to the tunnel vision, though, I think that can come with an experience, and I think it can come with egos. And it sounds like that's precisely what's happened here. All right. So a little bit about the crime scene. We have, like I said, Nona was lying in the front room naked, except for a pair of white socks. Her pants were found beside her body. They were inside out with her underwear still attached, like the legs through the undies there, as though they had just been pulled off. We'll talk about what that may mean in a moment, and it may not be what you're thinking. There was carpet cleaner. There was a bottle of carpet cleaner in the sink of the kitchen with the top off. So it had been open and was sitting in the kitchen sink. Her phone, a Motorola, I believe, was on the kitchen floor. The battery was off of it. So if you can remember, we're back in 2005. We talk about technology changing often on this show and how quickly it's changed over the years. If you remember the battery packs that were like on the back of phones back then, so picture a phone dropping to the floor and that battery pack being physically separated from the rest of the phone. So that's what had happened there with the phone. There was no forced entry noted. Like I said, there was blood pooled all around Nona. There was a little blood on the Venetian blinds. They're called Venetian, apartment blinds, guys, like the ones that hang vertically, those little slats. There was a little bit of blood there. Now those were where that sliding glass door is. Okay. And there, like I said, was no evidence of sexual assault. I'm going to touch on that really quickly. I kind of conferred with BC earlier about this specific part of the case, and his experience on what I often wonder this when they say there either was or was not sexual assault in a case such as this, where your victim is now deceased and not able to give you an account of what happened. And this would also play toward living victims who potentially aren't victims at all and make false allegations. How can one look and see for sure that it was actually assault instead of just consensual sex that maybe gets rough or whatever? How can they tell the difference? And I mean, in your opinion, do you have an opinion on that? I know you're not a medical examiner or anything like that.
And I didn't work special victims.
Right.
So as a detective, I did. So I don't ever get into the realm of something that I didn't work. But you and I have talked about it. I've always not liked that term that either people are using in television shows or documentaries or wording like that this is evidence of a sexual assault unless someone can explain the very visible.
Sure.
Yeah. Injuries.
So unless, like we said, unless it is very extreme like that, I'm not sure. So I kind of started researching into that or reading about that a little bit myself. And on a few reputable medical websites, I did look and excluded any idea of like geriatric or pediatric patients. But in average age, normal age, mid-age, female specifically, victims that are no longer living, it sounds like it can be difficult. It's easier if they have died actually to determine whether or not it was assault rather than consensual sex, because with the actual autopsy, with the dissection of the body, you can find more things internally, bruising to internal tissues and things like this that you wouldn't get on an exam with a living patient. Now, there was a study done or some research that had pooled that showed, for instance, in I think a poll of, or it was like a grouping of like 137 sexual assault victims. Now, these were living victims. There were, I think, out of the 137, there were 27 of them that showed any actual signs of assault upon examination. So as you can tell, about, a quarter may even show. So I know we're getting in the weeds with that a little bit, but keep that in mind when we talk about cases where they for sure say that there was or was not sexual assault, because that may or may not indicate your pool of bad guys, if you will. If people are known to have this certain predisposition for behavior, if they are known to be assaulters, and with, that are sexually motivated or not, that could skew some things, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. You use that to narrow down the suspect pool.
Okay.
Or be able to understand why it occurs and how it occurs.
Right.
Yeah.
So either way, they say that there was no evidence of sexual assault. We do have that condom wrapper lying there not far from her body. All right. So police go on and get there. We have Mark Frost. Please remember that name, Mark Frost. He actually is going to take on, he's lead on this case. This is the first homicide he's ever worked. Okay. So he asked Kevin, the boyfriend, if he'd come on down and answer some questions at the station. Kevin does. He's covered in blood. He complies. He, is essentially kind of shocky at this point. So he goes down to the station. He said he can account for his whereabouts. He was very accommodating with them. He answered all of their questions. He said that he explained his day. He had gone to this diner. He had woken up at this time. He had made these phone calls. He had seen his grandmother, XYZ. So he had kind of a whole day plan, or whole day that he mapped out for them that he had prior. This was in the evening. This is around 8 p.m. on the night of the 15th. All right. They talked to Kevin for 3 hours. They do go on, and before they let him go, at the very end, about 3 hours later, they asked Kevin just straightforwardly if he killed Nona. To which he replied, "I would kill myself before I'd hurt her." We do have some video of Kevin in the interrogation room. The very typical, like they walk out, and now we have footage of him kind of sitting there. There are moments where he alternates between putting his hands on his face and his elbows on his knees, leaning down, crying, praying. And then there's some more behavior there that we will talk about. So Nona's stepfather was interviewed, as were any of the men in and around and out of her life. Okay. So this guy, So remember I told you that mom got remarried in April of 2004 to Dwayne Dipert. It's Dipert in case I'm not enunciating clearly. So he was the one that had the strict rules about the curfew and the tidiness and the no animals in the home and all of that, right? So when they asked him what he was up to that day, he said that he had been Christmas shopping at the time of the murder. He had receipts to prove it. At this time, they're starting to think that probably Nona had been killed sometime between the hours of 10:30 that morning and 1 o'clock that afternoon. All right. So Dwayne says, nope, I was out shopping. I've got receipts. And he says that Carol, Nona's mom, says that actually Dwayne called her numerous times that day. Carol says, quote, and I told him that day, I said, well, you called me like 8 or 10 times that day, which was unusual at work. He hardly ever calls me at work.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
What does that make you think?
Anytime you get outside of the pattern of just like the average behavior on the day of an incident, you do want to pay attention to it. There's usually some excuse or some reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, you'd want to dig into that.
Yep. So keep that in your noggins, guys, as we talk. All right. So, excuse me. So then Kevin is released. You know, he wasn't charged with anything. They were just asking a lot of questions. So 6 days later, though, on the day before Nona's funeral, Kevin called the police to tell them about something he remembered. There had been some rumors circulating that a man was seen leaving Nona's place the day of the murder. While he was on the line, the police actually just said, you know, could you just maybe come on down to the station and answer a few more questions for us? Because now we're kind of interested in hearing some more things. So he said absolutely he would, but he tells them that her visitation is going to begin, you know, that evening. And make sure you're muted, okay?
Yeah.
So he says that Nona's visitation is later on that evening, and he wants to make sure he can be there for it. And they say, you know, of course, they assure him that they will be done long before her visitation starts. And he says, Kevin says, quote, I'll do anything you want me to. I'll do a DNA test. I'll do anything. So they go on and start asking Kevin some more questions. So about 20 minutes go by, and they ask Kevin now if he'd just go on and take a lie detector test. They're kind of doing the, keep in mind, guys, Kevin's 19 years old. Okay. So he's not an adult that's seeing around corners necessarily. If he is innocent, in fact, then he's dealing with the shock of finding a horrible murder scene involving the girl he loves. And they're kind of doing the pat him on the back, like, hey, buddy, I'm just going to go on and read you, you know, your rights. They go on and give him Miranda, do the whole thing. And they're like, you know, it's just because you're down here. We're talking to you. Let's just go on and get that out of the way. And he's like, sure. When they even mentioned a lawyer, he said no, like he didn't want one. He actually later will say that he was afraid that would make him look guilty. Like he didn't think he needed one. Quite clearly, he hadn't done anything, like is what Kevin will tell you. So about 20 minutes into questioning him this time, they say, hey, buddy, why don't you walk down the hall with us? Would you mind to take a polygraph? And he agrees immediately. He's like, yeah, absolutely. I'll do anything you guys want me to. He continues to say that to him over and over. I'll do whatever you need. So he goes. The polygrapher gives him the test. And when it's all said and done, the Mark Frost, the lead on this case, tells Kevin that he has failed the polygraph miserably. When you listen to the recording of their interview with him as they're talking to him, I would consider very obviously shocked at this. It doesn't sound like he's putting on a show. He just doesn't understand. He's like, I don't understand. Like, I don't understand how I could have failed it. That doesn't make any sense to me. And goes on and on about that. But pretty much in that moment, when they say that to him, they now have turned this corner and that's it. Like it's Kevin or nothing. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about polygraphs often. Most of you know, especially if you listen to the true crime stuff, right, that they're not admissible in court. They're only even good at all if you're looking at them as a whole. So if you've got all these other things that corroborate this story and you think someone has done it or hasn't done it, and then they take a polygraph and that backs up that narrative, that's one thing. But on its own, not so much. Do you want to speak on that at all about polygraphs?
Yeah, I've never used one. I was not a big fan of them, just me personally. Anytime you get technology involved, you can have a problem with that. I always encourage detectives. You're the detector. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to always be able 100% identify someone's lie, but you'll usually be able to pick up the stressors and then key in your questions directed more towards that. But I mean, just because someone says they don't want to take a polygraph doesn't mean they're guilty. And if someone says,
I'll never take one.
And if someone says, yeah, I want to take one, sometimes that's because they do want you to understand that they are innocent. Yeah. And they're trying to help you because this is a loved one who's been murdered, especially if they've seen that body. So,
yeah. I'll never take a polygraph. That's a new merch. I think it's a new t-shirt.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Deny the polygraph.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm on it. That's what's next. All right. So they tell him he fails. He, like I said, he's very upset about it. And now it's the examiner and the detective are now telling Kevin that there's no doubt in their minds that Kevin was actually the killer. The visitation now is starting. He's now been back at the station for long enough that Nona's visitation is starting without him. He, at this point, was able to, or was given the opportunity again to request a lawyer, and did not ask for one. He just tried to continue to convince them that he was innocent. So they talk about how they found a bloody palm print on the lamp that killed Nona, and they tell Kevin it belongs to him. This is interesting. When you listen to his voice, when they're talking to him and saying this, they're saying, we found you. We found your fingerprint. And you guys go, I'll put it on Instagram tomorrow. I will put it on Instagram. If I get enough subscribers on YouTube this go around, I can put them on YouTube as well for those of you that don't have Instagram. So y'all just keep doing that, okay? But when you listen to them tell him, and I understand the tactic of raising your voice or kind of intimidating a little bit or whatever, if that's the way you do it, if that's what this suspect needs, if that's how you're going to get your confession, let's say. But with Kevin, in this circumstance, Mark Frost is on him like a bulldog, and he is raising his voice right off the rip. And he's saying, I know you did it. I have your fingerprint. How can you tell me you didn't do it without your, and Kevin saying, I didn't touch the lamp. I didn't touch the lamp. Now, could Kevin have touched that lamp and say he didn't and be honest all the way? Yeah. Because he walks into a scene. If the lamp was laying on the floor next to her dead body and he's straddling her, providing CPR, moving her body around, he could have easily touched a lamp and not even remembered what happened in those initial moments of him arriving there, right? But he either did or he didn't touch it. And they're telling him that he did. They're telling him, in fact, that they have a partial palm print. If you're not aware, a palm print is like a fingerprint in that it is individual to a person. They are all different. We all have different palm prints, okay? Just like with your fingers. So they have it on the bulb of the lamp. So if you were to pick up the lamp and move it, I'm not sure why you would touch the bulb if you're trying to kill her with the base of the lamp. But either way, that's what they say that they have. Yep.
What, didn't he have access to the apartment? Had he been in the apartment before? Could he have changed the light bulb for her?
Correct.
Before?
So that was my initial thought.
Mm-hmm.
But then what they start to say is that the blood print of his was tacky. So they say it was a tacky blood print. Not like a dusted print received from the bulb. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm glad you asked that because that's exactly what comes into play here. Moving forward in this investigation, I'm using air quotes. Moving forward, they continue to say that the blood on that light bulb was tacky, yet we find out it was never touched. And they try to play it toward if Kevin had been there prior, and I'll tell you what the prosecution's theory is in a moment with Kevin. But when you play out what they have hypothesized happened that day, they use that, what they call tacky substance blood print on the bulb, to narrow down a time frame when he could have been there earlier and come back and it still hadn't cured, if you will, or dried on the bulb. Well, funny story, it was still tacky on that bulb days later. Mm-hmm. Now, that's something that maybe, I know you're not a crime scene investigators, but for the multiple crime scenes you've been on, could you confirm that blood can do funny things like that?
Yeah.
In certain volumes, and depending on weather or humidity, right?
Yes. Yeah. So to stick to something and say, well, it's still tacky or whatever, well, you usually have to let things dry out, that sort of thing. And you're right, I'm not going to get into the science of blood and that sort of thing. But yeah, I would imagine it's possible.
Yeah. So they kind of hinge a lot on this print they say that they have of Kevin's. He continues to be adamant that he didn't touch it. He doesn't know anything about the lamp. He didn't mess with it. Now, I will tell you that when he got there and I said that he straddled Nona, he will say he put his knee, when he describes what happened, on either side of her body on the floor to provide CPR. This actually is confirmed by the dispatcher, the 911, when the 911 call is made and first responders get there, they confirm that that's how he was found. He, in fact, once he realized that the CPR didn't seem to be doing anything, I think once logic is catching up with him about the state of her body, he reaches down and picks her up to pull her to his body. And when he puts his hand on the back of her head is when he realizes the hole there with where the lamp had struck. So needless to say, he is covered in blood. This is going to go toward the prosecution's theory as well. All right. So, excuse me. So they finally let Kevin go, but it was after 7 hours. So in this time, the visitation has started, and people at the visitation are starting to whisper. People are starting to wonder, where in the world is Kevin? Why isn't he here? Not Kevin's parents are wondering. They're at the visitation. They wonder why their son's not there. So they start to speak. They have a friend who has a sister that had worked in law enforcement who had said, hey, get him a lawyer. Regardless, get him a lawyer and go down there and tell them that you want your son. If he's not been charged with anything, he can leave. So Dad goes down to the station at some point during all of this and asks to see his son. He even said so much as, even if you need to keep talking to him, that's fine. If you need to bring him here with a police officer on each side of him, that's fine. Just let me see my son and talk to him for a moment, and you can go back to asking your questions. They were agreeable at every turn. But someone told him, okay, I'll go get him. They turned a corner and never came back. Time went by. Finally, Dad's losing it. It's been a long time. Remember, he was in there for 7 hours, and he's 19 years old. I mean, that would be tough on anyone. So he finally is released 7 hours later, and back at the visitation, we're back. Let's get back into the world of Carol and Dwayne Diapert, Nona's mother and stepfather. At this point in the visitation, and this is something that they will tell you now. They did on the interview with Keith Morrison 3 months ago, that Dwayne said he realized, wow, this is interesting. Kevin's not here, and his words are, quote, and all of a sudden it kind of like a light bulb going off in my head. I said to Carol, wouldn't it be funny if it's the boyfriend? At the visitation for a bludgeoned 19-year-old girl, your words are going to be, as the stepfather, wouldn't it be funny if it's the boyfriend?
Yeah. Had he met the boyfriend before? Do we know?
Yeah.
Okay. Did he know the boyfriend's name?
I
think it's interesting when people say, when they refer to someone as
a title rather than
that woman or that boyfriend or the boyfriend. If that's the actual quote, and I don't know. I don't know. That is That's a little strange. I will say towards the end, if we can come back to what Davey's talking about with some books.
Yeah.
In reference to deception and that sort of thing.
You'll make a note of it.
Yeah.
I'll write it down.
But
hey, Bosco.
Yeah, but just things like that, I think sometimes people get very caught in pointing fingers very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone is actually cooperating with law enforcement and they are at a station for 6 or 7 hours, or they're near the crime scene with detectives and they're sitting there talking to them for hours, other people will start to assume things. And that's tough during an investigation, because all you want to do is get the information.
Of course. Yeah. And that actually, word spread like wildfire about this, about Kevin being at the station for so long. And in fact, like I said, it's a very small town. This was Mark Frost's first homicide to ever work, which he makes it quite obvious. But the town immediately, he is the boyfriend. There are a few people that knew him and loved it, like did not think he had done it. But in terms of just generally speaking, the whispers very quickly went to Kevin. Unfortunately, I'm going to reference the chats real quickly here. We've got a listener, Bosco. Hey, Bosco, who said, yeah, but if he's 19, he's an adult. He is. And I'm not talking about him being tried as a juvenile or an adult. I'm talking about he spent 3 hours the night of the murder in the station, and now he's just spent 7. So I'm saying if you're 30, 40, 50 years old, 7 hours of police yelling at you and telling you you did this, if you didn't, is tough. If you're 19, I mean, at 19, I would have wanted to call my mom at this point if that's what's happening to me, but by now. So that's kind of why I just referenced his age, was more along the lines of that. But either way, so now we've got the stepfather. I will tell you, even at this point, without knowing anything else that I know about the stepfather, he's pompous. I mean, he's arrogant and he's pompous. And I think that we'll talk more on it, but that comes through even, like I said, most recently in interviews he did weeks ago. So it's interesting, though. So sometime that night, that same night that they had questioned Kevin for hours and hours and hours, the visitation came and went. But the police show up around midnight to Carol's house, Nona's mother, and they tell Carol that Kevin was the killer and that he was a sociopath with a narcissistic personality. There's not been one psychiatrist to interview Kevin. He has had 0 diagnoses, nothing. And they straight up tell Carol that he's done this. This is his psychological tendency. And I don't know. I just think that's bold. And I think it's incredibly rash and premature.
Yeah, you don't get into trying to identify people and any kind of personality disorders, anything like that, unless you are.
I mean, this is days after the murder.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. That's strange. I don't know.
Well, I think it's negligent. I mean, I think it's more than strange because he's not been diagnosed with it. I'm not saying he wasn't those things. I don't think he was those things, but he's never been at this point.
Right.
They've just yelled at him in an interrogation room for 7 hours and then go tell mom that he did this and that this is his psychological state as though it's a diagnosis.
I will also say, I think I mentioned before, victims, families get sometimes upset because we don't go into detail very early on. We don't talk about a whole lot of things, and this is why. Yeah. If you start telling family or friends of the victim that you have a suspect and you're going to make an arrest and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden
something happens,
you learn new evidence, or you learn new information. Now you shift, and then confidence is lost sometimes by the families, or people have a lot more questions. While it's frustrating, it's a lot easier to do your investigation and be very patient with the family, listen to them, talk to them, but explain to them that you're working the case and you're not going to give information out until you're done with the case.
Well, I just think, remember we were touching on and talking about tunnel vision early on in this case. And I feel like this is a textbook matter or presentation of this. So the investigators will say that they think Nona's crime scene looks staged. They think that Kevin being covered in so much blood looks suspicious. Their hypothesis is they think that Kevin comes to her house potentially unannounced. By the way, nothing's corroborating this. This was just like the theory, the working story that they had that they then made the actual prosecutorial case, that Kevin had come to her house earlier that day, that he had seen her receive a text message from another guy. We talk about this guy later. He's not involved whatsoever. He has an alibi. I won't even muddy everything with his name and worrying about that. But so they say that Kevin gets there. She gets a text from a guy. He sees the condom wrapper there, and that he gets angry and jealous, and in a fit of rage, he kills her and then makes it look like, leaves the condom wrapper there to make it look as though someone has come in. He then leaves, conveniently forgets to bring his key back with him, gets in the car with his mom to go there so that he has people with him when he finds her body. Then he gets on top of her so he can be covered in blood, so he can say that he found her and did CPR. That's their case. That's the case they made for him.
Yeah, the worst word that can be said during an investigation is theory. You never say theory. You don't start speculating. You just work whatever your evidence is. If you've got a condom wrapper, you should probably look at it and just be like, well, we're kind of fortunate there's some type of evidence that is telling us what was going on and that we can process. You avoid any kind of ideas or theories or speculation, especially early on like that.
Yeah, no, forget theory. Mark Frost sat down and wrote a short story. He wrote a novella and made a case around it. And I don't feel bad saying that. And if you've listened to my show ever before, I don't do that. And I don't say things so straightforward and black and white like that, especially when it comes to an investigation, because I don't know. And that's not what I do. But this gets more bizarre at every turn. So that's what they're taking. That's what they're going to want to take to court. That's what they say. The next morning, Kevin does go to Nona's funeral. That same day, the police chief, who was James Bacon at the time, had a press conference. And at that time, he says that all persons of interest were cleared but one. He does not give names. And on March 31st of 2006, Kevin was arrested. So remember, the murder occurred on December 15th, just prior, 3 months prior, and Kevin was arrested in March. They do go on and move the trial to the city of Ozark just to try to get him a fair trial. But even then, there were whispers and rumors and things like that where he went. They're all very small towns, so 1 or 2 counties over isn't going to do a whole lot, really. Kevin's family actually had to sell their generational farm to produce him with a defense team that they felt was going to be worthy of this case. And Bosco, one of our listeners, just mentioned something about prints. I would assume in reference to the condom wrapper, and we are actually going to talk about that. So now the family farm has been sold. He's got a defense team amassed for him. And now we've got the condom wrapper. They will tell you that the local lab or forensics or analysis place, if you will, told them at the time that they could either test for prints or DNA on that wrapper. They could not test for both because either one would destroy the evidence so that they couldn't test for the other. We find out later that was not true science. So that's not how that had to be. But when picking if they wanted fingerprints or DNA, they chose to go with fingerprint testing on the condom wrapper. Okay. So that's what they pick. They find when it was tested that, excuse me, they didn't have prints on this. They still think that Kevin's motive is jealousy. The defense says that the police work was sloppy. Kevin's lawyers now want to examine Nona's phone. Remember that phone that was lying on the kitchen floor with that Motorola battery pack off, separated from it physically, right? So they want to look at Nona's phone. It was found there at the crime scene, but lead investigator Mark Frost tell Kevin's lawyers, like, I don't have it for you. I gave it to her stepdad in the middle of the investigation because evidently Dwayne said that he wanted to use it. He liked it better than his own. He'll now say that he's frugal, and so he didn't want to buy a new phone. He liked Nona's. So he asked them for that evidence. He asked them for Nona's phone back so he could use it. He gets it. They have only input data now, meaning that Dwayne put data on her phone because he deleted all of her data. He deleted her contacts, her text, everything. So like a factory reset, and then just put his contacts in it so he could start using it as his own personal cell phone.
Oh.
What do you say?
Okay. That sounds to me very strange and out of the ordinary just as a human being. I mean, it just seems very strange. And in that time, what was that? You said 05-ish?
Uh-huh.
05-ish?
By now, yeah, into 06
yeah,
now.
So
Excuse me, y'all.
There's still information that could be extracted from that phone.
Like a hard extraction somehow, like deleted information.
And back then, probably I don't know what type.
They might not have known about it. Remember, a teeny tiny town.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Every department was kind of scrambling for the technology. You had these boxes basically that you would plug the phones into, and it would extract as much information as possible, the phone numbers, that sort of thing. But I mean, at the end of the day, that would still be considered a piece of evidence, especially in the state that the phone is found in.
Mm-hmm.
If it's broken, does that mean she had it in her hand and she hit the suspect in the head?
Mm-hmm.
Does the suspect now have an injury caused by that phone? And would that suspect's DNA potentially be on the phone? I mean, there's a myriad of things of why you would want to keep the phone. I don't fully understand why you would give it to someone during the investigation like that. I mean, I know.
So that was going to be my next question for you. Yeah. Would that be normal behavior?
No, and it is an uphill battle because family members often do want items or want access to a home, a car, or whatever. If the crime scene is still secure, you're going to hang on to it. Nobody's getting access to that normally. I mean, as common sense dictates, but something like that is broken or appears broken and is within the crime scene and within arm's reach of the victim.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have to assume you're going to hang on to that. I mean, we would. I don't. Yeah.
Well, I just think that I would, because at this point, you guys have got to understand, and we've not touched on it yet. They're starting to learn that as lovey-dovey and faithful as we thought that Nona and Kevin were, at the end of the day, they are college kids that were living 90 minutes apart and had entertained other lovers, if you will. So Nona at some point found out that Kevin had been with another girl, and then so she kind of gets with another guy, and then there was another guy she was talking to, but he said they never had a sexual relationship. So we learned that there are other moving parts here. There are other males involved in her correspondence and potentially sexually as well. So then in that light, I would consider the phone or her contacts or her last text and all the things something that I would consider evidence that would stay with the rest of the things from the case. But being that they didn't collect very much evidence or develop this crime scene very thoroughly whatsoever, I'm not incredibly surprised that this is something that took place here. Excuse me. So that's, I just can't, and we'll come back to her, but Nona's mother, I couldn't have my husband using my murdered daughter's phone day one, like right off the rip after she's dead with his contacts in it. And every time his phone rings, it's like, that's just so, I don't know. That's bizarre.
I think that's what I was trying to say, is that's a little abnormal for just the average person, for most people.
Mm-hmm.
And
we've got a few abnormal things now, though.
Yeah.
Because the man said what he said at the funeral.
Yeah.
And what was the other thing that I had my note on that I think I wrote the word weird. I literally said weird. Oh, when he said that about oh, when he called Carol the day of the murder, and he
Yeah.
called his wife 8 or 10 times, and she said, well, it's so weird. You called me so many times that day.
Yeah.
Then at the funeral, he says, oh, it'd be funny if it's the boyfriend.
Mhm.
And then he takes Nona's phone.
The phone thing, okay, I'll tell you this. It doesn't say he's the suspect. My gut and his behavior says that it looks like that there was something to do with the phone that he did not want anyone else to see or know about. I just don't.
Can you be a creep and not be a murderer? Yes.
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 Yes. I mean, I'm frugal. You're frugal. Like there's a level of that. There's also a level of strangeness.
Bizarre behavior. That's bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move forward because we've got a lot to talk about here. So when we talk about that crime scene development and the way this was investigated, side note real quick, and I will try to not engage the chat so much, but Bosco makes a great point that back then, I think we used to use SD cards, and we did. We popped in the cards.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to go back to look at when that technology changed to the SIM cards, to the whatever. But even when it went to SIM cards, you'd still go to your local AT&T or Verizon. They take them out, switch it out with a new one. Before we did everything at home,
Mm-hmm.
mailing in your phones and getting it,
Yeah.
the phone company would do all those things for you. And then once your contacts are gone, now we've got clouds and backup networks and everything else. And they
Mm-hmm.
transfer digitally, or somewhere in space to the next new phone you have. But that's a great point. Maybe when we say he erased her stuff, he could have literally just popped out her card and popped his in. I don't know.
Yeah.
Either way, he requested her phone and they gave it to him. So both sides of that I think are interesting to note. So evidently, in terms of developing the scene, the only place that fingerprints were swept or developed were just physically, literally around Nona's body, like right around her actual corpse, not anywhere else in the home. There was blood near the front door, like I said, and on the Venetian blinds. That blood was not taken. They didn't test that blood or analyze it to even see if it was hers or not. Maybe she's been fighting. We know she's been fighting with someone. The medical examiner has already said that. Like, this isn't a case of, oh, was it a defensive wound? It sounded like she actually had fought quite a lot. I don't know if I've never read anything about them taking anything from her fingernails or anything like that.
Yeah.
But the blood was never tested that was outside of her immediate body area. The sliding glass door was never dusted for fingerprints. The one that did not have the bar on it that it would normally have, the one that Kevin was able to open and get right in, didn't test it for prints. They didn't take any footprints from the floor. Evidently, they never even went up the stairs. This was a 2-story apartment she lived in. So never even went up the stairs. Yeah. They literally only went to the places where they thought Kevin had been. Once they assumed Kevin was the murderer, which was the day that they found her body.
Right.
So she had 17 stab wounds in total to her neck and shoulder. Like I said, her hyoid bone was broken, and she had finger pad bruisings around her neck, indicating manual strangulation. And like I said, she had that giant skull fracture pressing into her brain from the back of her head from that lamp base that was found beside her body that did or didn't have a partial bloody palm print from boyfriend Kevin that he still denies was his. So moving forward, they set forth with the trial. They present their case, as we talked about a moment ago, this just story that really is not corroborated. None of it makes a lot of sense. None of it.
Right.
They can't back up any of the things. It was just like, oh, nope, he came here. He found her texting someone, saw a rapper in a jealous fit. He does this, then takes her clothes off, stages this to look like someone else had come in to do it, because this 19-year-old who has all this forethought in a fit of rage, if it's what they say, if this was an unplanned, this was not premeditated, it was in anger and in jealousy and in rage, and he snapped, and then he was able to plan and set and place and go back and formulate the idea of getting the friend and the mom and forget the key. I mean, that's a lot. It's a smart dude if that's what...
I mean, it has been done before.
I'm sure
People have staged crime scenes, and
after
there are
certain
like things. Yeah, there's certain things you are looking for. At 19, I mean, there would have to be other indicators going on.
Just
It's
a lot of
just-
moving
yeah.
parts.
Yeah, and when you talk about tunnel vision, when whomever is the lead detective says, "Hey, we think it's this person, so all you need to do is process this," or this is a person who would already have access to the house, and they were supposed to be here, so don't even worry about the door frames. Don't worry about the doorknob,
the second
walls,
level of the house,
the lights switch, everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if you do that, then you don't have that evidence that you've processed the scene that you can go back and compare it to and say, okay, well, if he is our person, then there shouldn't be anything else. There shouldn't be any DNA. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So they didn't know how they were going to pay for this. Well, first of all, second day of trial, first day comes and goes. Second day of the trial, or second day of deliberation, excuse me, the jury deliberated for 8 hours and Kevin was found not guilty. Okay. So he's found not guilty. Carol and Dwayne are upset about this verdict because they, at this point, are saying that they think Kevin did it. It's no doubt in their mind that Kevin did it. Please keep in mind the dynamics here. Carol and Dwayne, it's not that they weren't a part of Nona's life, but Kevin's family seems to be more involved in Nona's life than Carol and Dwayne. They seem a bit more at arm's length. Keep in mind that I never want to blame a victim's family member or anything like that, but it's interesting to note that Carol's mother, unfortunately, the terrible, terrible tragedy of Nona being sexually abused by her biological father up until the age of 10 when he died. Who knows how long that would have continued for, right? Mom finds out about that, had been unaware that it was happening prior, right? And then finds out about it. And then gets to be later with a man who, at the very least, I would consider minimally controlling. And I don't know to what ends, but she agreed to move into with her daughter, even though it cost she and her daughter their animals. The rules for her 19-year-old daughter changed to a 9 p.m. curfew, and mom was okay with that. There's nothing to show that there was any pushback there. So to the point that she allowed, Nona to go on and leave and move away to accommodate Dwayne's rules. And, it's just something to think about when we think about. I would just like to know a little bit more about mom's childhood history, or what kinds of things maybe impacted her psychologically over the years, that she seems to have a pattern of finding these men who maybe just aren't the best ones for her, and maybe kind of help control her life a little bit. I would say it that way, I guess. But either way, at this point, Kevin has been found not guilty. Kevin's father, Hiram, now remember, this man has already sold the family farm. At this point, they know they're going to work for the rest of their lives. I mean, his mom's a librarian. Dad worked this farm. He didn't know how he was going to pay for it, but he asked if they could go on what they could do to investigate Nona's death and try to find the real killer. Shut up. The lawyers agreed, and the investigator. So what I just said through my sparkling water, that Kevin's father wanted them to find the true killer, that he's been acquitted. He's done for, he's good. They can move on about their lives, but that was not enough for Kevin's father. They loved Nona, and I've heard him in multiple interviews. I mean, she was like a daughter to them. So they wanted to figure out really who did this. So they find this guy. This guy's actually pretty amazing. But it's funny when you think small town. This is kind of like when you watch a movie and the guy's like the mayor, and then he runs the auto body shop, and then he's the whatever. Mm-hmm. So this guy, Todd Steffi, he actually was a part-time policeman there in Dover. He was a full-time preacher and investigator. All right. So he agrees to continue to investigate the case. So one thing that this new legal team does for Kevin is find a match they try to find a match to the DNA found on the condom wrapper. So they went through and they spent money. All right. So it says, like in my little notes here, I got that excuse me, they went back through and contacted any of the men that Nona had been seeing before her death, right? I told you that we learned that there had been some other boys, just like Kevin had had another girl or two. And so they start talking to them all. They start collecting their DNA to the point that, so like, think about what we've got in terms of investigating the case. And then think about this, this investigator who's coming through to help Kevin and help the family try to find the real killer. They go so far as to find one boy that she'd been talking to, that she was no longer, that had kind of broken off soon before her death. And they find like they take a girl to basically be like a ploy, bait to go on a date with this guy. And they wait for him to go to the restaurant so they can then collect his straws for his DNA, test his DNA, so they're doing everything they can to get the DNA from anyone she had been around to see if it matched the DNA that they found on the condom wrapper. Because do you remember when I said that Mark Frost said they could only test for fingerprints or DNA? That was false. They could not find the DNA that matched. What happened was that Nona's parents did agree. Now they're kind of back in the game to pay $600 to have this DNA sample tested from the condom wrapper. Okay. So now they're talking to some other friends, the people that maybe were talked to initially in the investigation and kind of were dismissed. They're coming back through them. All right. They realize that Todd Steffi I was telling you about, that Nona's neighbor, this man named Gary Dunn, his bedroom window looked directly across the parking lot of the apartment complex to Nona's living room. His window is facing her window. I think they say about 50 yards away in one of the things I read. Now, that's interesting, not really in the terms of just the layout of the apartment complex, but Gary Dunn had actually been booked on burglary. He had been in the system before for some other things. In fact, much more than burglary. This is interesting and maybe something that should have been thought of before, because do you know who booked him the first go round? Mark Frost. So when this guy comes up, his name is familiar. Mark Frost should have been like, this guy actually has quite a past. We're going to talk about that. Yeah, antennas go up, right? So is that what you were doing? Was that your antennas going up?
In my glasses.
Oh, I thought that was your antennas. Is that how your antenna goes up?
Yeah, that's how it goes up. My glasses adjust. Sorry.
That's your superpower. So they get Dunn's DNA. He agrees. They get his fingerprints. And I'm sorry, I said earlier that her parents, they paid to have his stuff tested now against what had been tested through this DNA. So a couple of weeks later, the results come back. It's a match. So now they need to recheck Gary Dunn's alibi. So they briefly talked to him before, and he said that he had been with his mother that whole day. He was like probably around 30-ish at this time, I believe. He was an adult. He was married and his wife had 2 kids. So originally, Gary Dunn told the police that he had been shopping with his mom. That would have been the time of Nona's murder. He said they went to Lowe's and got some things. They had been painting. But Todd Steffi goes through these boxes and boxes of papers that pertain to this case. And he was kind of done with it because he can't really find anything to corroborate or negate this alibi. And he found Dunn's receipt. It turns out that Gary Dunn had, in fact, not been shopping with his mom on the 15th of December, like he said. He had been shopping with his mother on the 13th of December, 2 days prior to Nona's death. So his whole alibi, his whole story, that whole foundation is gone now. He's no longer where he said he was when Nona was murdered. All right. So these receipts had been turned in to Mark Frost. All right. We have a new prosecutor on the case. And 1 year after Kevin was acquitted, Gary Dunn was then charged with Nona's murder. Do not forget what I just said, because we're going to come back to that in a moment. Those receipts had been turned in to Mark Frost. The lead investigator had receipts that were supposed to corroborate Gary Dunn's alibi. And in fact, they don't. And he takes them kind of tucks them, doesn't say anything, and doesn't turn it in to prosecution leading up to Kevin's case. That's huge. That's very, very huge. And if you don't know why, we're going to talk about that in one moment. I'm going to try to race through this as it's getting late. But so Dunn's trial began in April of 2010. His newly ex-wife, they had not long before this been divorced, Jennifer, testified against Gary Dunn. She says when she gets on the stand that he sexually abused her during their marriage, to the point that she was actually forced at one point to undergo an emergency hysterectomy prior to their separation because of some things he had done to her. She also said that her husband became increasingly violent as the marriage progressed and increasingly sexually violent as the marriage progressed. She kind of describes in detail some of the sexual things he had done, but at the least, he would sometimes put his elbow on the back of her neck to hold her down while he was raping her. I mean, it's not having sex with her at this point. He also had recently, prior to their divorce, began using condoms because he was engaging her in acts of forced sodomy. So one thing that has never come up, I can't find it anywhere, but I would be very curious to know the brand, right? Like
that's the first thing I was going to say.
Right. So I can nowhere ever anywhere. And I wouldn't reach out to this poor woman after all of this stuff to ask her that question, but that's what I would ask is what, was that the first?
Quick note is,
hey, James,
if he would have been identified early on, as in who all lives around her, who has access, who can see her windows, that sort of thing, and his alibi didn't match up with the receipts, if you do a search warrant at his place and you do find a box of condoms and it is a match with the brand, that sort of thing, it just starts to add to it. I mean, I know that sounds like common sense, but that's also why we keep a broad view.
Scope. Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about Gary Dunn and his connection or non-connection with Nona. Okay. Gary said he didn't know her. He said he didn't know her at all. He didn't know who she was. Like he'd seen her across the parking lot walking, to her from her car, but that was it. Jennifer, his wife, says that is not true. She said, in fact, he did know her because about 2 weeks prior, or a few weeks, prior to her murder, her being Nona's cat got loose. I'm going to say in quotes, got loose, because this later is disputed. And Gary Dunn had it and brought it to her. Like to the point that he took it into her apartment. She let him in. He had her cat. So defense starts thinking, prosecution starts thinking that, he's using this. Like he took her cat to return it to her, right? So now he's in good graces. Everyone has said Nona would not let anyone in her apartment unless she already knew them. So now if he's friendly with her, he's returned her friendly cat. There might be a reason that he could have been let into that apartment. If she opens the door for him, maybe he has the cat again. And she opens that front door. He comes in, locks it, does what he does, moves the bar and opens the sliding glass door and goes out. Yep. I don't know, but that would be what I would first start to think about. So his wife says that he does in fact know Nona, and that's what had happened. Also, 2 weeks prior to Nona's murder, he had been seen lurking in the doorway of Nona's apartment. So there is some, I don't want to go into this too much because the details get a little skewed, but the wife will say that right before her murder, days before, she woke up in the middle of the night or late at night, and Gary was not in bed. Okay. So Gary was not in bed. She thinks that he's outside smoking a cigarette. So she grabs a cigarette and goes outside to meet him and sit out there with him and talk. Okay. He's not there. So she's lit her cigarette and turns around and sees him with another woman exiting Nona's apartment. Now, the reason that I don't want to talk about it too much is because there's not much more detail. That's what she says. And she said that when she says, hey, she confronts him, like, what are you doing? You know, like, why are you over there? And the woman he's with kind of quickly quipped back something like, not like a none of your business, but like a, I don't know, some kind of quip, and she leaves. Now, there's never been mention of who the other woman is. No one has come forward to say it was me that was with him. So that's really, there's not a lot of detail there, but it's something that the wife will say. His defense will say that she was spiteful and hates him and is going to make up these lies to say against him or whatever. So that's kind of how this back and forth is going. Mm-hmm. A lot of he said, she said. The cat situation, though, is interesting. I don't know. So they use the condom. I'm pulling up a picture that I screenshotted that had the results of talking about the DNA. Because the DNA that was tested from that condom wrapper that came back to match Gary Dunn's actually says that this Labs International place showed 2 male DNA profiles potentially on this wrapper. Neither one matched Kevin, the boyfriend, for the record. But when they compared Gary Dunn's to it, they found that, you know, they look at these DNA alleles, and so they found that everyone matched Gary Dunn's profile, but it was only a partial profile. And so since it didn't contain enough for the 13 genetic markers required for the FBI's DNA database, they can't quite use it. Yeah. There's a statistical probability that it is almost certainly Gary Dunn's, but it didn't fit these 1 or 2 little marks to be able to then be used as, now it's circumstantial. It's not like science fact-based that it's his DNA. Okay. So while it can be persuasive, there's not a whole lot they can do with that there. Okay. So, excuse me. His defense, Gary Dunn's defense, was really kind of just trying to put the spotlight back on Kevin. They didn't really, you know, and we know it's not the defense's job to prove innocence. It's the prosecution's job to prove guilt, but they couldn't even really say a whole lot. They just said that, you know, hey, it was Kevin. the guy who's already been acquitted. That was the boyfriend. Yeah. Okay. So the judge declares a mistrial because they say that this DNA is circumstantial and that's all they really did have. We're not really focusing too much still on the fact that he had no alibi. Not that is enough to convict someone. Yeah. It's important. So a second trial actually took place against Gary Dunn. So they try again to convict him. So they began in April of 2011, 1 year later. Okay. But this time his history was allowed to be revealed. The first time, it's a death penalty case. So keep in mind, you've got to be extremely careful. I know you can talk on this at great length. I'm going to kind of skim over this part a little bit just because we're running to the end here. But during Gary Dunn's first trial, they did not admit into discovery or into evidence or for the jury to hear his history, because if they're not super careful, particularly with the laws surrounding a death penalty trial, they could get the death penalty trial thrown out. So they got to be very careful with what they admit or what's admissible in court. The second time around, though, they go on and allow it. Okay. So this time we get to hear about the fact that he was a felon with a very violent past. In 2002, a woman named Kelly Jo Fitzharris had gone for a jog. So this was 2002. Nona was murdered in 2005. Okay. She was on this trail. She says that she passed by. There was a man who turns out to be Gary Dunn sitting on a bench on this trail. As she passes by, the trail veers off to the right. Okay. So she says that she's approaching him and has to kind of pass him and go up on this trail. And that does make me, we don't have a lot of time, but it makes me think about things, because sometimes I approach people as I'm running and I start thinking, so I've actually turned around and start going a different way before, depending on how I feel about it. But
as you should,
you know, like what, I don't know.
Hurting
like,
anybody's feelings.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like I might have, and sometimes I continue on the path and don't think a thing about it. Right. But it's interesting. So it does make me wonder if Kelly, as she's running, is starting to get that spidey sense of like, oh gosh, I got to pass this guy. And sometimes you do. Sometimes as women, we do the thing like, I don't want to look weak, or I don't want to look dumb, or I don't want to look scared. or whatever. So instead of turning around and going away from what's potentially a threat, you kind of are like, it's going to be fine and keep going, right? So she runs past him. The trail veers off. She immediately hears footsteps behind her. She turns around. He's running quickly toward her. He was carrying a huge stick. It actually sounds like a limb because she estimates it to have been between 2 and 2.5 feet long and around 5 inches in diameter, which is later, that's what they say it was because they found it. He catches up with her. He hits her over the head with it. She gets knocked down. He starts beating the fight. He's beating her with this giant limb over her head, the right side of her head, I believe. She starts to get up. He knocks her back down. She at one point says that things start turning black and she thinks she's going to die. She thought this is like, she kind of has started having these like end of life feelings, like I'm going to die right here on this trail. And then she also then had the same idea of, like, no, I'm not. Like, hell no, I'm not. And so she's able to somehow get to her feet. She's terrified. She starts to try to stumble run. And as she does, she turns around and he's running in the opposite direction. While he was beating her alternately with his fist and this limb, he's yelling, he's going to kill her. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. Oh. Beats her senseless and runs off. We don't know that he didn't know that he didn't kill her. Or maybe in the last moment, he got a little frightened and wasn't ready to do something like that yet and leaves. But either way, he's screaming. She doesn't know this man. So it's not like he's angry with her. This is a very random stranger on stranger attack, which is freaking terrifying to me. So she's able to get away. Police are called. They find him hiding in water at the end of this trail later that day, whatever. They arrest him. 18 months in jail, first of all, for what I'm considering attempted murder. He's telling her he's going to kill her and beating her senseless. 18 months, though. So he had been paroled just months prior to Nona's murder. Okay. So after 2 days of deliberation on this second trial of his, the jury was deadlocked. And once again, the judge has to declare a mistrial. We are wrapping up the show, guys. I know it's getting late, but the jury has since said from that trial that they all think he did this to Nona, but they couldn't convict him based on the way the case was investigated, based on lack of crime scene development, lack of follow through, lack of anything else. They just couldn't believe that any of it was right. Please remember that Mark Frost was investigator on this case where the attempted murder took place with this jogging woman. So when he is investigating the case of Nona's murder, a woman who, oh, by the way, they both have short blonde hair. It's just a coincidence, I'm sure, but interesting to know. So when he's investigating Nona's murder and he realizes one of her neighbors is a man that he has actually, like, I don't know if he was part of the arrest or just the investigation of the crime earlier, but he knew of Gary Dunn's past. He knew that this man beat a woman. And now he is the one who's recently been paroled and lives 50 yards from this girl that is murdered. And he gives him an alibi that is erroneous. And he knows it on black and white paper. It says the wrong date. And that was it. Him being a suspect was dismissed. Okay. And that receipt from Lowe's from Gary Dunn on the wrong day, not the day of Nona's murder, not the one that would corroborate his alibi, is not turned into prosecution. So the mistrial occurs in December of 2011. Kevin's family files a $10 million lawsuit against the city's former chief and one of its officers. You know which one? I'm going to go with Frost. And so they accused them of ignoring evidence that pointed to Kevin's innocence. We learned that Mark Frost withheld his handwritten notes that would further implicate Gary Dunn. Also, the polygraphs. Remember the one that Kevin evidently failed worse than they've ever seen anyone fail a polygraph? Well, later we learned that Kevin Jones. Later we learned that Gary Dunn was asked to take a polygraph and that he passed his. That he passed his with flying colors, in fact. We have recording of the interview room after Gary Dunn's polygraph. He walks out of the room and the polygrapher tells Mark Frost that he just sighs. And then he said his breathing was very erratic. He got a -1 or a -1. And in polygraph rules, which I don't care about a polygraph. We talk about this, right? But I do care about manipulation of evidence or manipulation of anything related to the crime. He says his breathing was erratic. He was all over the place. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Dunn did not pass his polygraph. In fact, Gary Dunn failed. Guess who did pass? Kevin Jones, the boyfriend.
Mm-hmm.
And he was told that he failed it. And then that was used to kind of corroborate this novella that Mark Frost wrote that's now called The Case Against Kevin Jones. So Kevin passed it, the boyfriend. We find out later that the guy issuing the polygraph for Kevin wasn't even certified in using that. Like he didn't have a certification in that discipline. Okay. So taking all of this into consideration, Kevin Jones' family files this civil suit. If for no other reason, Kevin will say now, like, he's like, yeah, the money would be great. I would love for my parents not have to work until the day they died because of everything they did to help me. But he's like, I would rather these people not be able to do this kind of thing again. Okay. Their civil suit was dismissed because the statute of limitations had passed by 3 months. Kevin is now married. He actually went to law school and has recently graduated. He is now a criminal defense attorney who practices back home in Russellville, Arkansas.
Wow.
Right where all of this began. Carol, Nona's mother, no longer believes that Kevin is her murderer. In fact, she pretty much changed her mind very quickly once Gary Dunn came around.
Yeah.
And oh gosh. But then moving forward quickly, Mark Frost said at the time and even later on that Gary Dunn is not a threat to society and that he probably wouldn't be seeing the inside of a jail cell again. I don't know how you would say that on when you look at a sexually motivated crime that is assault against a woman and then a potential murder, an assault, an attempted one, and then a potential one. But at every turn, he's wrong, and he was wrong again because in 2017, Gary Dunn was sentenced to 10 years in prison on 2 counts of possession of firearms, and he was a felon. He was then released on parole in August of 2018, but less than 4 months later, he was back in custody. This time he was charged with attempted kidnapping, indecent exposure, and 2 separate incidences that occurred in the same day, where he approached a woman with his penis in his hand when she was at the loading dock of the place she worked one night, and then another woman he tried to force in his car before she could get away. He was arrested then in 2018 on that. And then in November of 2019, he was found guilty on those 2 charges. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but required to only serve 1/3 of that. That would be 5 years. And then just 2 months ago, he was denied parole, which he will be up for again in 2025.
And he will continue that cycle of behavior.
He will never stop.
Yeah.
We know it escalates, and I've said it before, there are a lot of things I'm not hard-lined on. I'm hard-lined on pedophilia, and I'm hard-lined on these sexual aggressive crimes because the rehabilitation rate is zip.
Yeah.
But real quick before we go, do tell everybody a little bit about that, because the reason it's so important the reason it's such a big deal that Mark Frost did not turn over his handwritten notes or that alibi destroyer, the receipts from Lowe's that Gary Dunn said, he didn't turn that over to prosecution approaching Kevin Jones' trial.
Yeah. Every state's a little bit different on this. And in 2005, I would imagine that at least most states were pretty much the same in that you had to hand over what's called discovery. Okay. And that is everything. That's your handwritten notes, those receipts, anything that you are collecting, your crime scene photos, processing your crime scene, everything. If you're out there collecting list of tenants in the apartments behind her, and you've got that list, and that's part of your report, that's going to be in your discovery. The whole reason you do that is so that whomever's being charged has a right to be able to go through all of that and look at it.
Okay.
The defendants get a copy of the police report. They get to read the supplements. They get to read witnesses' statements. They get to read the handwritten notes and look at them and do all of that. because they have to be able to prepare to defend themselves against
Right.
the state. The defense does not have to do that. So sometimes people get that mixed up. But in this case, that's probably where some of the problems lie, is that if you're not giving over things. And I'm not saying that he framed this guy or in that sense, like in the movies. I'm just saying it sounds like probably inexperience or some type of problems with handling and how they processed it and that sort of thing.
I feel, and this is where we started, and we'll circle back around it in the show, but when we talk about tunnel vision in a homicide investigation specifically, we have what started with inexperience, and that's not me saying it to be ugly about Mark Frost. That was his first homicide investigation. So he gets to the scene, whatever reason, XYZ happens, and he immediately thinks it's Kevin. We've talked about how dangerous it is to do that because now he has to make a case that makes it plausible that Kevin is the actual suspect. He is the perpetrator of this crime. And then I think his fatal downfall was his ego, because once other things start coming out and once his theory, his idea, the case that he has built and surrounded everything around, that it's Kevin Jones, when that started crumbling, because Kevin has alibis, there's nothing else that points to Kevin doing it. And then we get Gary Dunn in the picture and he throws those alibi destroyers in his pocket and forgets about those. His ego was what was in the way of him going back and being like, oh, I got this one wrong. We need to go after this guy. Instead, he was trying to hang it up on Kevin, and hand over fist, I bet you anything, he thought that he was going to be able to get a conviction there. And it was too late. And so he couldn't come back from that. I will tell you that Mark Frost is now moved over to a neighboring county, and he is the assistant police chief in that county, and he runs crime scene investigation. And evidently he's certified in hostage negotiation, which I would implore you, if not, I'll try to grab some audio clips to go back and listen to at least part 6 of Keith Morrison's interview. It's toward the end of part 6 of Murder in Apartment 12, the Dateline podcast on this show. And it's where Keith Morrison is interviewing Mark Frost concerning this case. This was 3 months ago, so it's a very recent interview concerning this long ago case. And to this day, Mark's temper raises. He sounds just like he did with Kevin in that interrogation room, when he's screaming at him, when he's telling him to sit down, to not go anywhere. He now will say, that boy was free to go whenever he wanted to. And then he was very surprised to hear that Keith Morrison had the audio from that interview room. So the man's temper is he's got a short fuse. He yells quickly. He's quick to anger. So I think all these things play into how this case was investigated. And just know that if you live in Russellville, Arkansas, don't get caught up with the law, because I don't, or that neighboring county where he's now at. Oh my, it's been a long one.
I just want to say one thing real quickly. I can't type in the comments, but I can read them. James Barber asked about returning evidence.
Oh, yeah.
And police officers,
he came in a little bit after we talked about that.
Yeah, detectives can return. Usually they work with a prosecutor if they're going to release something. It's a horrible idea. They can do it, though. But, yeah, it's horrible. Meaning it's a horrible idea.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of chatting back to those in the chats. You guys, I really appreciate y'all being here as always. I'm very thankful for you guys and for your listens and supports. Please do hit the like button if you hadn't, because that would be great. Hit the subscribe button on the YouTube channel if you haven't. Tell your friends. Brittany Faulkner, I have not forgot about you. You guys, Faulkner won the Halloween contest where she guessed what our costumes were properly. If you haven't seen those costumes, I suggest you go back and look. But she guessed it, so I told her I'd send some merch her way. Gonna do that. Got some new merch coming up soon, hopefully. So tell your friends, subscribe, like, do all that stuff. Follow me on Instagram at Andrea Upload if you have not. To those of you that are new to listening here, hit the subscribe button, all those good things. Leave reviews if you don't mind. I'm going to beg and implore you, please, so this channel can not even just grow, but kind of get back to where I was a little bit. That'd be great. But you guys are already helping with that, and it's going well so far. But BC, you want to tell them a little bit about you and what you're doing these days?
I am still doing the Disruptors podcast with my buddy Ski. Every now and then he may miss a few episodes just because of scheduling.
Sure.
But we're still pushing on. And I'm doing online like virtual training. So basically, and usually I post the schedule on there. It's for non-sworn and citizens that they can just DM me and let me know they want to take one of my courses I offer. And most of it's gang courses right now. We'll get into some other stuff, some proactive strategies of police work and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But and I'll probably do some type of 2-hour session or something in reference to homicide investigations so that people can ask questions and answer them. Kind of like what James is doing in the comments, just to be able to get that information out there. So
his classes have been coveted. Like he said, he's already done some gang ones, and he's got slots up. So if you follow BC Sanders or the Disruptors podcast with BC and Ski on Instagram or on YouTube as well. On Instagram specifically, you can see class dates and times. He'll throw those in his stories. It's easy as can be. You can live wherever and just sign up for those. DM him for that information. You can just Venmo over the money and then hit a slot, and then you're in. And then he'll do the class. They've been turning out really well. So those are great. You got some hoodies, I think, for sale right now at Minor League Studios.
I do, in fact. Yep, some black hoodies. And I usually post that in there. Minor League Studios website. Click on it. It's on there.
Davey, take a class, buddy.
Yeah, definitely. Hit me up. Sign up. We'll do it. The books.
Carly's taking a class, I believe.
Yes, she's in there as well. Coming up, I think it's next week. The books Davey had mentioned earlier, Spy the Lie, I believe it is.
Uh-huh.
The one about what everybody is saying, and that's actually by FBI agent Navarro, if I remember, and that's off the top of my head. I apologize. Great book, all on body language and deception. Left a Bang, same thing. It's all situational awareness. But yeah, he had mentioned those in the comments, and I can't say enough things about reading and understanding human behavior, especially if you're investigating homicides or that sort of thing. The team effort, the team approach is much better than having to do it by yourself as a detective. You miss a lot of things. You get overwhelmed. It's tough. So I say that because small towns are battling that when they have a homicide. So I don't like to bash, but also we got to be professional. We got to do our job and due diligence and never charge the wrong person for murder.
Agreed. High five. Well, I appreciate you filling in and being the co-hostess with the mostest, the co-hoster with the moster. I don't know. None of it. You're not a lady. So speaking of ladies, actually a couple weeks ago, I did a great podcast with Beth LaMontagne from the, the Bars Open with Beth and Greg. And so I do enjoy seeing those guys and doing stuff with her, doing a little lady stuff. But hey, you guys, again, thanks so much for showing up and doing this stuff. And I guess until next week, we will see y'all next Tuesday.